Welcome, everybody. My name is Jocelyn Mercado, and I am here today with Robert Romanyshyn. Welcome, Robert. It's great to be talking with you today.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Great to be here.
Yes. And so Robert Romanyshyn is a teacher, writer, and psychotherapist. And the topic of our webinar today is Ecological Crises are Spiritual Crises, the Wonder of Silence and the Miracles of Beauty. And I know, Robert, you wanted to give an introduction to what we'll be covering here today.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. I wanted to talk about one aspect of the ecological crises that we face today, and that is how they represent a spiritual crisis in the Western self, in Western humanity. And in doing the book on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where I try to read her text as prophetic and a prophetic parable for our time, I identified 8 particular ways in which her book is relevant and necessary for us to consider today, some of which we can get into later. But one of the things that stands out is that we tend to neglect, in looking at the crises that we face today, the crises of nature in every aspect, our air, our water, our land, the animals, that we tend to emphasize, and rightly so, we should pay attention to how they are ecological problems, how they are political issues, and also how they, how we need scientific facts to understand these crises. But what is often left out is the psychological dimension, and specifically the psychological dimension that gives a place to unconscious dynamics in our relationship to ourselves, each other, and nature. And that's what I'm trying to get at here, to look at how an archetypal pattern from a psychological point of view runs through the West's scientific technological mindset that I try to trace out its origins in the 15th century in the book I wrote many years ago, Technology as Symptom and Dream. And that archetypal background is how we tend to split spirit from matter. And when that happens, and as that has happened, spirit becomes identified with the cognitive, rational mind that pulls itself away from nature and then begins to understand nature as simply an inanimate dead object. So we have dead matter, a mind space somewhere inside each of us, cut off from nature, and the spirit matter split means that unless we get to reconnecting somehow, matter and spirit, we are not going to be able to really solve what is very fundamental to our ecological crises.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. And so could you speak a little bit more then about how ecological crises are spiritual crises? How do you see these tied together?
Yeah. When spirit and matter are not separated from each other, which, by the way, von Franz, an important early colleague of Jung, whom I'm sure many of your audience knows, she pointed out that the spirit-matter problem is the key issue of our time. So to talk about the spirit of nature and to talk about the ecological crisis as a spiritual crisis is to lose the sense or to forget that we are part of nature, belong to it, and not apart from it. And that nature, in its relationship to us, and we in relation to nature, nature surprises us with its appeal. It calls us out of ourselves because it seeks to know itself even more fully through us. And that has been whole history of Western culture being able to listen to what nature is asking of us so that it can further realize itself. And that's nature's spiritual dimension and our spiritual connection with nature. So by spirit, I don't mean any kind of religious dogma. I mean the animation of the world. When you put spirit and matter together, what you are talking about is how nature and humanity, human consciousness, the link is soul. And soul is like the third that holds that link together. When you split them, then spirit, as I said, becomes just us, imposing our will upon nature, using it as a resource, and matter as something to be manipulated, measured, and used by us.
Yeah. Yes. And so I know that Anne Baring, who is the Jungian analyst, and she's the author of The Dream of the Cosmos, has said that your forthcoming book is a really brilliant and profound analysis of this, our dream, right? Our current dream of dominating nature, right? This Frankensteinian dream, and using the Earth's resources for our own ends. So could you share a little bit more about that and how your new book is related to this theme of our call today?
Yeah. Well, first of all, let me back up and say that the Frankenstein story of Mary Shelley is a parable for our time. That's not something that I've claimed, but something that many people have claimed and have commented on. And it has endured because of the way in which her work is visionary. That is, it just doesn't comment on the present moment in which she was living and writing, the early part of the 19th century, but it tended to anticipate what this dream of Victor Frankenstein to be a new creator god, where that would lead, particularly when he denies responsibility for what he has created, abandons his creature, and actually never gives him a name. And so I try to tell the story from the creature's point of view, because that becomes a key element in the way that I took up her story and rewrote it from the monster's point of view. Because unless we learn to face the consequences and accept the darkness within us that would turn away from the monstrous consequences that we produce when we don't take responsibility for our actions, when we deny what we have done, project it onto others, that unless we begin to face the darkness within, then it only grows. And that's what then comes back to us as an individual crisis in terms of our symptoms, or the cultural symptoms now that we see nature expressing. So what I tried to do then was to take the story that I wrote in 1989 in the technology book, and then it was reprinted many times. But I wanted to make it more available to a wider and general audience. It surprised me that the technology book has done so well, but it did well in certain areas. And in fact, from 1989 to today, the world has gotten worse. I mean, the crises we face today, politically, economically, ecologically, socially, etc., they have gotten worse. So I felt a kind of pull or obligation, not a choice so much, but as something that I was trying to respond to, and that is how unless we wake up, we might very well be, and this is not just me talking, in my new book, which I'll get to in a minute, how that unfolds, it's a series of questions designed to open up the reader's imagination and respond in how they see the crises that I identify, the 8 questions that form the core of the book. And it goes back to the necessity. The first thing is to wake up and acknowledge that unless we solve this crisis, we might very well be one of the last generations of humankind. There's an author whose book, Sapiens, A Brief History of Humankind, Yuval Noah Harari. It's been a bestseller, Times bestseller. He does this sweeping thing about the history of humankind, our species, Homo sapiens. And he ends the book, and I didn't know this when I was writing my book, with a section entitled The Frankenstein Prophecies. And it's in a chapter called The End of Humanity. And that was Jung's concern. I think he saw, far-sighted vision, that we are on a precipice. And that then begins to get you thinking, why did I write the book? What motivated me, you asked. That gets you to thinking generationally, not just in terms of the ancestors, but in terms of those who are going to come after us. What are we leaving behind? And all I'm trying to do in the book to make it appeal to a wider audience is to touch the heart. Because I think one of the things that awakens us, certainly not fear. You know, fear-mongering only makes people more defensive, insular, isolated, separate, cut off, except from their own tribe that speaks the same language. Nor does simply distracting yourself through amusements or trying to forget or numbing yourself with narcotics and drugs, etc. I'm not condemning anybody who does that. Sometimes the anxiety, the pressure is overwhelming. But what I think we are called to do then is to think beyond our own local concerns, to think generationally, and to feel the sorrow for what we have done, to move us into a more humble position where we're touched by the grief that we see all around us in nature, and in our own grief that we share, begin to ask, I guess, for forgiveness from within. And for that we need, and that comes a big part of the book, we can't do that if we have nothing that is larger than us. And that's the absence of the sacred, which when Victor Frankenstein says he's a new God, what happens to the gods then? However you understand your God, it's some transcendent quality, the spirit in human beings that longs for something more and higher and different and than himself or herself.
Yeah. So could you tell us a little more about that, the loss of the sacred, right? And you have written that, we need to really call attention to this, to how this is happening in our times.
It's the human person's relationship to the transcendent. So I'm going to use the word sacred to speak about the transcendent. Ever since we stood upright and looked up to the heavens and saw the stars, this is in one of Plato's descriptions about how that beauty awakens something in us as a longing. Ever since that beginning, we have known, we have responded to, we have needed a sense of something sacred. And in the Greek world, that was already in some of their literature and plays a sense that what happens when we lose that sacred dimension? Well, who are the gods then? Or what is the sacred? And the sacred is what gives us our place. It's like a measure, not in the sense of just measuring something, but a measure in the original sense of the word, something against which, well, you have to say we are measured by, and in being measured by the sacred or the gods, we find our place. And what is that place that we find? We find that we owe, or we have an obligation to be responsive to what calls us and to be in service to some sacred dimensions of life, to discover the patterns that even rule our individual lives, of which we are not the maker. And so the sacred then, in that sense, helps us to dwell on the earth, beneath the sky, with others in the world where we have to come to terms with our mortality. And that is another aspect of the sacred, because I think what turns us to that awareness and necessity for the sacred is how we come to terms with the fact that we're mortal. You know, if anybody really takes that into their life, not that you become morbid and depressive and depressing people, but you realize that in the face of dying, how do we live our life? And that's where the great religions of the world have responded to us, but where also they have missed how the gods or the sacred are not to be found just out there, but again, in Jung's sense, to be found in the indwelling of our own heart. We are the symbolic, or maybe I could stay with symbolic, the symbolic expressions in everything that we do of the gods, of the sacred speaking through us. So I hope that comes across. Mm-hmm. And what happens in Mary Shelley's story is that Victor anoints himself as a god. And when we lose our measure, all kinds of problems arise. As we see, for example, in the God wars, the religious wars today. Because then it's not that each of us are in service to something other, but I am the God, or I belong to this group that has their gods, and yours can't be true. So it's an overriding concern. Think of the sacred as a canopy under which we are all in celebration of life.
Yeah, I love that. And I think it's just so important to look at all of this in the way that you're presenting it in your book. And I think that we have a tendency today to want to just turn away from what we might know is happening to the environment, or from what we might even see happening in our own lives, or to turn away from our mortality, because it's hard to look at. But when we do, and when we seek the truth, that's when we can really awaken and really, open up to the fullness, to the sacredness that is there.
And I think where that leads me is we have to find the doorways or the portals through which the gods or the sacred, I speak of the gods because I come out of the kind of Jungian tradition, but you could use whatever term you want, a higher power. I'm comfortable with the sense of the sacred. We got to find the portals through which the sacred now shines through. It's not that nature is dead. It's that we believe that nature is dead. So how do we awaken from that nightmare, or that dream which has become a nightmare, as if we are in charge, as if we are the gods? Well, we have to find those ways in which still the sacred peeks through nature. And to me, that's the important aspect of the Frankenstein book, because I give lots of examples of how, through experiences of silence and experiences of solitude and experiences of wandering and wonder in the natural world, and experiences of the epiphanies of beauty that you know, if you just open your eyes, they are like miracles. And those are like the ways in which nature is still trying. I mean, when I say this, I know it might sound a bit new agey, but I don't mean it in that way. And I'm not criticizing new ageism. I've gotten too old to criticize anybody else. I'm still struggling to find my own way through this mess that we've created. But it's like, I love watching little kids now, you know, before they become jaded, and particularly in our culture with video games and cell phones, etc. But you take them out into nature, and every moment is the eternal present. They are so in the moment, and every moment is a wonder. A little bug crawling on the ground, or the color of a flower. And they could, I mean, if you take a walk with a 3-year-old just around a half a block, it could take you 2 hours because they stop and they notice. That's what I'm trying to recover. That's the point of the Frankenstein book. That's the appeal. Because in that silence, when I was in the Antarctic, I made a DVD of that. People who want to see a clip of it can go on my website. That journey for me was a spiritual transformation, because it's one of the last unspoiled places on earth. If you get out to certain places, not where the big naval bases, etc. And the silence is overwhelming, and the solitude, and a sense of serenity and oneness with the natural world emerges. So I'm all for then paying attention in wonder with things that have become forgotten, unnoticed. Like right now, I'm sitting and I'm looking outside my window, and there's a lot of green plants, and a strong wind has come up, and the leaves and the plant is moving. And I want to go out there and dance with them, because, and you know, people will say, well, he's anthropomorphizing. Well, maybe we need to anthropomorphize a little more and not be so concerned that we're going to be judged as being childish or irrational or foolish or whatever the case may be. And maybe just celebrate that it opens the imagination for us to be connected again with the world. And there's nothing wrong with that. So, other things that I would say about ways of coming to open those portals or find the portals back into the spiritual connection with nature, the spiritual matter connection where soul erupts and holds it all together, is the value of getting lost. Do you know how difficult it is to get lost in today's world? I mean, it's ironic to me that we get enraged, or not enraged perhaps, but concerned about the violation of privacy with the internet, the loss of identity, when we aid and abet that every time we use our devices. So we have to be more conscious of what we're doing. Not to get rid of technology, because you can't do that, but to strike a balance between embracing it uncritically and negating it without any questions about what its values really are. So try getting lost one day, unplugging your phone. Sitting in silence. Well, the best one for me is, how many of us can just sit and waste time? Even the way we say it. Well, I'm all for wasting time. And just see how that sets with you. Yeah. I also think that one way into recovering the spiritual dimensions of nature, its aliveness, in addition to silence and the miracles of beauty, those sparks of epiphany, those epiphanies that light up, is two other things, three maybe. One is to pay attention to your dreams. That's, without any question, that is the deep importance of the work of Freud and Jung at the beginning of the 20th century, that there is a wisdom deeper than our conscious knowledge that we have to attend to. And not even to interpret the dreams, but to be with the dreams. Let them be a way of kind of seeing the world through the images that the dream presents you. I think it's wrong to begin to make sense of them immediately, because the dream is like a stranger who knocks on the door, and if the first thing you say to somebody who comes to your door is explain yourself, make sense of yourself, it's inhospitable. So that's the other thing. Learn to be hospitable in moments, less willful. Welcome what comes. Ask what it wants of you. And then to practice rituals. Because one of the things that indigenous societies are always characterized by is the sense of the ritual practices that inform their relationships in different moments of their day and in different seasons of the year. Rituals make things extraordinary. They honor what is sacred in the moment. And then I would say too, the third thing is the wonder of friendship, of sharing in person, in and through our bodily presence to each other. The community of being those who come together to eat and share stories and witness each other. Now, this, what we're doing now, I'm glad we can do this. But I remember once, a long time ago, meeting you for the first time in a restaurant somewhere up there in New England. And as much as I value this opportunity, because we can't always do that, that was different. Mm-hmm. So without judging one against the other, remembering not to lose what those other moments are like. You know, when you sit with somebody, oh, you want a piece of my bread? How is your soup? Would you like to try it? I think I've told the story many times. When my grandson, Jonah, was about 2.5, he was eating a piece of something. And he said, Grandpa, you want to taste this? We were on Skype. And again, I love to be able to Skype with him because I can see him. And I said, sure. And he goes like this. And then he pulls it away. And at that moment, if you looked at his face, there was the dawning awareness that there's something different here than being with Grandpa. Yeah. And, you know, as an old line professor, I thought, well, here's the beginning of a philosophical vision. But that's not the point. The point is to help him understand the value of being able to be together in Skype, but at the same time, not to lose sight of it's not the same thing as, hey, Grandpa, you can have a bite of this, and him taking it back and saying, you took too much, you know, or take another bite. So, you see, that's all. Actually, what I'm doing seems to me to be very simple, but at the same time, hard to practice and hard to do. So, well, I know we have a time limit. I hope this has been a little bit coherent. I'm simply trying to share the urgency of what we have been talking about, particularly the eclipse of the sacred. So if it's okay with you, I would just like to very quickly that's a bad way to put it, describe very briefly the format of the book.
Absolutely, sure.
So it's called Victor Frankenstein, the Monster in the Shadows of Technology, the Frankenstein Prophecies. And the format is questions. And it took me a long time. I've been working on this book maybe 5 years, and I kept changing it. But when I hit on the fact that I don't want to tell people anything that they don't already know, but maybe don't know that they know it. So what's the best way? And it's the old Socratic method of raising a question. Because what do questions do? Well, I go into the book 3 different kinds of questions, 3 levels of questions. But there are some questions that stop you in your tracks. You know, like a good therapist might do. And it makes you pause for a moment and say, wow, I never looked at things in that way. So each of the questions have the same format. And in the first question, each question has a part that identifies a theme in Mary Shelley's book, and then the question that I asked. So question 1 is resurrecting the dead, which is what Victor Frankenstein does. And the question is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of the dangers when we try to act as if we are gods? And that's what we've been talking about. So I go into that with examples, with stories. Question 2, the melting polar ice, because the whole attitude that Victor has toward nature is expressed when he goes to cemeteries and digs up the bodies, and he no longer sees that church cemeteries as sacred grounds for ritual of remembrance. So the melting polar ice is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of the dying of nature. It's amazing how this 18-year-old woman wrote a visionary text 200 years ago. Question 3, the monster's body. Is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of the monster's descendants? And there I go into the whole question of cyborgs and more importantly, the monster whom we have to face. In Victor's story, the monster is not a cyborg, but that's the arc that we're on now. He is like us, even in his disfigurement, and that's what appeals to us. Don't turn away. Look at what's in yourself. See me as a mirror, like I am a mirror for my creator. Question 4, from Africa to the moon, is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of creating a new species of humankind? Question 5, from astronauts to angels and clouds, is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of us as maybe the last generations of humankind? And that maybe is the most chilling chapter in the book, because we're heading towards a kind of extinction. Question 6, WWW, adrift in the digital world, is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy being homeless in a wide webbed world? And I'm not just talking about homeless people on the street, but I am talking about them, and I give some examples of encountering them. Talking about we're homeless because we no longer have a home and find a home in nature, because we've distanced ourselves from too much and said nature is dead, you got nothing to offer us. And then we die inside as well. Question 7, fundamental question, who is the monster? Is Mary Shelley's story a prophecy of a new kind of ethics, which begins with take responsibility for your own darkness in personal relationships, in familial relationships, in collective relationships, in relationship to nature? And then final, question 8, what are the other seeds of hope in Mary Shelley's story? And there, surprisingly, is where I say, if you read Mary Shelley's story from the point of view of the monster, it turns out to be a love story, because his desire for a mate is to be in a relationship that is not about power, but about companionship. So that's what I try to do. It's a user-friendly text. All of the scholarly notes, that I've collected over the years, that may be crazy sometimes, they're all in the footnotes. So you can read them, or you can just read the story.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for all that you've shared here. And I know I want to share the screen here. And maybe I'll let you speak just a little bit about this, that everybody who's listening today can have a 20% discount if they pre-order your book. Is that correct?
That's correct. The book is coming out mid-May, but I think the price is $39, but you save 20% if you order it by using the code
and I will give this to everybody. So you want to go to this web address right here, and I'll leave this on the screen for a moment so you can record that and use it. And I'll also put that in the description of this video.
Mm-hmm.
And then you would want to enter this code here, right? BSE19.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that'll work. If it doesn't work, then go to my website, and I'll probably be some links set up on that too. So I know you have to go. I don't want to hold you up. I want to express my thanks so much. You've been a great friend, a great support. So thank you.
Yeah, well, it's an honor for me to have this conversation with you, and yeah, to hear these ideas that you're sharing in your new book. And I'm very excited to share this with everybody and really get the word out about this, because it is so important for our times.
Thank you.
So, thank you for writing it. Thank you for sharing about it here in this webinar today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Thanks.